On the 25th of March 2008, CT announced Tetris Concept's first ever major online tournament. It was called the Carnival of Death, named after a rudimentary machine translation of the earlier Death Festival, and the date, March 25th, was chosen to reference the 325 Tori-Khan associated with Death Mode. 17 players ended up participating, with Jago achieving the highest level of the event, a frustratingly close 960. Thanks to the overall success of the carnival, it was decided that it would run again the following year. In the meantime, both the top players and the new players were grinding to increase their skill. One of the most promising newcomers was 15-year-old Kevin Burrell, going by the online name Kevin DDR. Like much of the community, Kevin discovered the TGM series through Tetris Japan Finals. However, unlike most players at the time, he mainly focused on TI's world rule, having come from playing the guideline Tetris DS. Unfortunately, with no TI available, even on an emulator, he had no choice but to play it through clones like Textmaster. He was also a staggeringly quick learner. In November 2008, the United States finally received its own genuine TI arcade board at the Acme Bowl arcade in Seattle, Washington.
Alright, hello Tetris Concept, hello YouTube. This is Kevin DDR, Kevin Barrel, reporting in at the first Tetris the Grandmaster 3 Terror Instinct cabinet in America. Hopefully it's actually at the arcade. Is it here? Holy shit, yes it is. I gotta call Guitar. Hey, you'll never believe it, I'm standing right in front of a Tetris Grandmaster 3 cabinet. And you're also on video, I guess, because I'm calling you on a video that's going on YouTube.
Kevin, being the one who convinced them to buy the board, began playing it religiously, and by the end of the year he had reached qualified M7 on World with a Master O game, although interestingly he still hadn't achieved the comparatively easy TGM1 GM. On the 30th of December, a Japanese end-of-year tournament was held in Ofuna. Jago, who now lived in Japan and had been learning from the top Japanese players, decided to attend the event. And on his very first game of TAP's Master Mode, Jago had become the first Master GM outside of Japan. Well, it was in Japan, but either way it was an exciting end to the year. As 2009 rolled around, many of the Western players declared their resolutions for the year. Jago was hoping to achieve an Orange Line GM, CT was hoping to become the second Master GM behind him, and Kevin confidently declared that by the end of the year he would achieve the World Rule GM qualification, becoming the fourth TI GM in the world and the first outside Japan. This was, putting it bluntly, an insanely ambitious goal, but he was dead serious. The new year would also bring a gift to the community. On the 4th of January, MAME version 0.129 quietly re-added TA and TAP, although this time Tetris Concept agreed not to discuss it publicly on the forums or post any videos. Kevin's fancy new TI cabinet also came with a reality check. It turned out to be one of the lowest earners at the arcade, to the point where Kevin was literally the only player some weeks, which eventually led to it being pulled. It was then set up at another arcade in nearby Tacoma, where it also received close to zero attention and was thus pulled again, eventually just ending up in Kevin's house, which worked well for him. On a lighter note, the second Carnival of Death received far more attention than the first, with 46 players in total, fully cementing it as an annual tradition from then on. That's how quickly things can end in this world. Just like that. And you never see it coming. On the 23rd of June 2009, Caffeine announced that Tetris Concept was shutting down. The wiki was to be migrated over to the hosting site Wikia, and the forum would be kept up for the next 2 weeks before disappearing for good. Why, now and all of a sudden, was Caffeine shutting down the site? It's time for me to move on. Well, why not just hand it over to a new owner? It just wouldn't feel right to me. The reactions to this were, unsurprisingly, universally negative. Offers to take over were rebuffed, pleas to keep the forums up were denied, and the bargaining soon devolved into arguments. A Dutch player, Mafanyo, proactively decided to register TetrisConcept.net as a backup, a move Caffeine called hijacking Tetris Concept's legacy, all while insisting that everything would be fine as long as the community just picks a new site with a new name. None of this behavior makes any sense. What was really going on? The main issue, at least I believe, is that Tetris Concept was not supposed to be a TGM community. This whole time it was meant to be a general Tetris related forum. In fact, Caffeine wasn't even a TGM player, his main claim to fame was his 40-line time attacks. But a large portion of TC's members were there specifically to discuss TGM. And by 2009, he was done maintaining a site he wasn't interested in, so he was shutting it down. Wikia was and still is a controversial service, and one that the community had previously turned down as an option. But now that the wiki was being shut down, Caffeine unilaterally decided to hand it over anyway. He wasn't willing to send anyone the database with the forum posts, but he would let them make their own archives. He was even willing to redirect tc.com to whatever new site they came up with, but not if it was tc.net. Tetris Concept was his project, and he wasn't handing it over to anyone else. Not the name, not the database, nothing. The conflict continued to build up until the 26th, when Caffeine gave up arguing and just took the site down immediately. And that would be the end. However, people did, in fact, make their own archives. In response to the announcement, one of the community members had scraped all of the forum threads, and after the shutdown, a script was written to convert the HTML back into database form. The result of this is that by the 29th, TetrisConcept.net was up and running, complete with all of the old forum posts, much to Caffeine's dismay. Since TC was still mostly TGM centered, another member did end up doing as Caffeine requested, and started a new forum for general Tetris discussion named Hard Drop. The wiki was eventually moved to Wikia, but confusingly both tc.net and Hard Drop had also copied the data to create wikis of their own, meaning there were now 3 competing versions of the same wiki, and 2 forums for what was supposed to be one community. And so, June marked the month where Tetris Concept split in 3, but the TGM community survived, and this time it probably wasn't going anywhere. The 2 forums and the 3 wikis all live on to this day, and Caffeine continues to renew his domain every year, just to make sure nobody ever gets TetrisConcept.com. Throughout mid-2009, Mihara gave a series of updates regarding a few different TGM games. Surprisingly, he was still actively trying for the PlayStation port of TGM 1, although he was now hoping for it to be added as part of the PlayStation Store's Game Archives section, allowing it to be played on both the PS3 and the PSP. Unfortunately, however, EA currently held exclusive Tetris rights for both of those platforms, so Mihara would have to wait for the opportunity. He was also still looking into releasing TGMK, possibly for the Nintendo DS, but profitability was a concerning factor. He didn't want it to just end up like Ace again. Finally, he was pleased to announce that a public location test was happening for Tetris the Grandmaster 4, the Masters of Round. It was originally going to be Knights of Round, referencing the Knights of the Round Table, but it got changed. And yeah, it's another arcade game, but Mihara had still put serious effort into reaching this point. About a year prior, he had created Club TGM, ostensibly a way for trusted players to post TGM content without repercussion, although in reality it was just another attempt to make TTC happy. Look how trustworthy our community is, they follow the rules. And don't worry about the people overseas, they're not invited to the club. Wait, what do you mean they have a TI cabinet?
That's pretty okay, right?
The TGM4 location test was happening at the 2009 Amusement Machine Show in late September. Here's the situation. Sega had been brought on to be the publisher for the game, which was being developed for their ring-wide arcade board. However, Sega was also testing another Tetris game at the same show, Tetris Decorous, known outside Japan as Tetris Giant. TGM4's success at the show, both in general and relative to Decorous, would determine whether or not Sega goes ahead with publishing it. So let's see what it had to offer. TGM4's Master Mode appeared to be basically the same as Tap's Master, just with more Torikans and no grades. The far more interesting mode was Rounds, the equivalent to Death in Shirase. This mode came with a new gimmick. For some sections, the bottom half of the board would freeze, preventing any lines from being cleared. Rounds appeared to go beyond level 1300, but it turned out to be too difficult for anyone to find out how far it actually went. TGM4 also brought back Kamui, although it was unavailable, as well as Konoha, a gimmicky big block mode with the goal of clearing the board as many times as possible. The visual style this time around was a seasonal nature theme, with the contrast between the cheerful aesthetic and the brutal gameplay being somewhat of an intentional joke. In a pleasant surprise, Gen 8 would be at the show to perform demonstrations, as not only was he one of the best TGM players in the world, he was also a playtester for the new game. Actually, more than that, he was now working at Eureka as a developer. Thus, Gen 8 has now graduated to producer Hiroshima. As a gamer, this is like the ideal result. But even producer Hiroshima's divine intervention wasn't enough to save this game. It performed terribly at the show, and for good reason. It had nothing to entice casual players, and almost nothing to entice the hardcore fans, an already small group. Across the show's 3 days, TGM4 had only barely managed to make it into the top 10 on the final day. Decorous, on the other hand, was in the top 3 for all 3 days. And of course it was. It's Tetris. It's free money. This wasn't even that exciting for TGM fans. How do you fuck up this badly? There were a few more location tests over the next few months, and they did receive a reasonable amount of attention, but most of that attention was coming from long-time TGM players. In fact, the whole series had mainly been acting as a series of filters. TGM1's player base was largely people who had played Sega's Tetris. Tap's player base was largely TGM1 players, TI's player base was largely Tap players, and most of the people interested in TGM4 were TI players. After the last location test in late November came silence. By early 2010 it was clear that there was some kind of hold-up. It just wasn't clear which company was the cause. Eventually, in June, Mihara responded to a direct question about TGM4's status. Ask Sega. July, nothing. August, nothing. September, Mihara finally spoke on TGM4 again. Whatever had been going on behind the scenes, it hadn't worked out, so he was admitting defeat yet again. TGM4 was cancelled. But who exactly was to blame? Instead of the expected issue being poor performance at the location tests, Mihara placed the blame entirely on clones, specifically clones overseas. His dejection had turned into anger, and his scapegoat was overseas players and their reliance on clones, something he was suddenly mentioning quite a lot. Tetris Concept was reading these posts, and thus, in an attempt to soothe his restless mind and maximize the chance of TGM4's release, they decided to officially instate a prohibition on the discussion of clones, similar to many of the old Japanese forums when TI's release was threatened. But this was a highly controversial decision. The community was heavily split on how much impact such a change would have on the viability of TGM4, and whether it was worth limiting such a major aspect of the Western community to give weight to a game of debatable importance headed by a man with such intense disdain for them. Either way, it was clear no progress was being made towards the release of TGM4 anyway, and by December the prohibition was reverted. However, during that time an interesting development came to light. Entering the story is the American Alex Kerr, going by the online name Kataru, an active member of the community who had also learned of TGM through Tetris Japan Finals, and who had recently become the second Western Master GM behind Jago. Since he and the other Western players had reached out to Mihara and received nothing but arguments and sulking, Kataru decided he might as well contact Hank Rogers directly, under the assumption that TTC were behind the cancellation.
A lot of us have been left puzzled and saddened in light of a recent post on Ichiro Mihara's blog, stating that Tetris the Grandmaster 4 has been cancelled. If you're at liberty to do so, do you think you could explain a bit more about what exactly happened?
This is the first I hear of it. I'm looking into it. Nothing to do with me or TTC, I'm a big fan of everything Mihara has done.
Yes, even in 2010, Hank still personally responded to emails about Tetris. This response seemed to indicate that Sega was at fault, but Eureka themselves may have also been part of the reason the game wasn't being released, if they felt they wouldn't make back the cost of publishing and promotion. Meanwhile, a deflated Mihara had basically just been arguing with people on Twitter. I may have somewhat lied about the cancellation announcement. It actually stated that clones were just one of the reasons, but it was the only reason he listed, and over the next few months his stance would gradually shift until the clone wars were apparently the source of all his problems. By this point he had completely abandoned his restraint. Far from being appreciative of Tetris Concept's prohibition and their attempts to reach out about it, he was now effectively threatening another round of video takedowns. If he was hoping for the community to take their content down voluntarily, that wasn't happening. Half of them now hated him. Meanwhile, Hank had sent another reply after a follow-up from Kataru.
No problem. We've been working with Eureka for about a year to try to get them to renew. Apparently Sega is not willing to publish Eureka's next version. That's the holdup. I hope we can get Eureka to do a new version. We really like what they've done in the past, and there's no holdup on our side.
Finally, we arrive at what seems to be the source of the issue. The most likely course of events is that after the location tests, Sega had either changed the terms of their publishing offer or they were reconsidering partnering at all. The prevalence of clones was probably a factor in their decision, because Mihara was now convinced that was the main, if not the only problem. And by the end of 2010, his mind was set. When another TC member contacted him on Twitter regarding the prohibition, Mihara revealed more about his personal view on the matter. Your Japanese is a bit weird, so I may not fully grasp your intent, but I'll respond to the best of my understanding. There's no doubt that Hank is a fan of TGM. However, that and the issue of licensing agreements are separate matters. The project was cancelled because the clone issue wasn't resolved. That's the reality. Tetris Concept has lifted the ban on discussing clones now, right? Then there's even less point in having a conversation. Clones demotivate me. Naturally, I don't feel like pouring my heart and soul into it for people who support those who simply copy our efforts and achievements, which we painstakingly thought through and refined over time. Do you have any idea how it feels to not be able to release TGM4 after going to all the trouble of making it? Of course you wouldn't understand, would you? It's as important to me as my own child. It gets trampled on by clones, and when that gets pointed out, do you think I can just say, sure, we'll release it anyway? Now I understand the cause. Over these past few months, the licensing talks suddenly froze because you contacted TTC with such matters, didn't you? TTC isn't an organization that operates solely on Hink's decisions, though of course he is an important figure. There are other licensors to consider as well. In other words, it was you who obstructed the revival of TGM4. Too bad, really. It also turned out that Mihara hadn't noticed the original email Tetris Concept sent informing him of the prohibition, and regarding it he had this to say: "After the clones are gone, we can talk." Now the tragic picture can be seen in full. Sega's publishing offer was either untenable or retracted entirely, presumably due in part to clones. Mihara, frustrated at having wasted the past year with a nearly finished game sitting around, dropped his filter and began arguing with people over who was responsible. Kataru, unable to reason with him, contacted Hink, which then, according to Mihara, drew TTC's attention to the situation, thus jeopardizing the license completely by accident. And what had been achieved? Tetris Concept had just spent the past few months in a civil war over the prohibition. CT had left, as had a dozen others, over a miscommunication. Mihara was miserable, as per usual, and despite his demands, the clones remained. What's Kevin up to? Kevin did not meet his resolution of achieving TIGM by the end of 2009. He may have been a little ambitious at the time. He did achieve all of his goals besides the GM, and it's possible he wasn't too far off if he wanted to keep going, but for 2010 he had decided to switch to practicing Classic Rule. In fact, all of his 2010 resolutions were for Classic. Another player had also joined the forum at the end of 2009, the 16-year-old Steve, a player who also specialized in World and was qualified M6. Steve would then proceed to immediately disappear again, but he was still practicing. Over the first half of 2010, Kevin grew to be the top US player in basically every mode across all three games. He was MV in Classic by June, and by December he was qualified MM in both Classic and World. The only other player who was this good at both rules was producer Hiroshima. Kevin was inches away from GM. In either rule, it didn't matter, he just had to make the final stretch and not plateau. But it was beginning to look like he might. He didn't see a single GM exam in January, February, March, April. Finally, on the 31st of May.
Yeah, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god.
A well-deserved GM. There were some who believed that Kevin had this unmatchable talent that meant nobody else could play at this level, but
What the fuck? Oh my god, no way!
Kevin would end up getting 3 more Classic GM exams in June, all of which he failed. In July, Steve appeared again to announce out of nowhere that he had achieved qualified MO, just 2 steps short of GM, and he was going for GM as well. It only took him until September 7th to achieve qualified MM, and since Kevin still hadn't passed any of the exams, it was beginning to look like Steve might manage it first. A week later, on the 13th of September, one of these 2 players announced that they had achieved GM. However, the very next day, the other player also announced that they had achieved GM. So, who got it first? It was Kevin, with Steve the day after. The Western community was astounded, the Japanese community was pretty impressed, even Mihara congratulated Kevin, after confirming he was playing on an actual board of course. Unlike Kevin, Steve had only been playing World rule. He liked World, but to the community, World was the inferior rule, the easier non-TGM rule. With all the peer pressure, getting the GM in World just didn't feel the same. So Steve decided it was about time he got good at Classic Rule, but he was finding it a lot more difficult than expected. Despite a full year of effort, by mid-2012 his qualified rank was still only M2, so he ended up just moving on from TGM entirely. Kevin, meanwhile, had basically just grown bored of going for Classic GM due to the lack of competition. So he sat at MM, mere inches from the finish line. Nobody else in Tetris Concept was even close to GM in either rule. The Western community's zenith had passed. By 2013, it felt like the TGM series as a whole was in its final chapter. Stagnant, slowly being eaten away by entropy. New people weren't really getting into the series, nothing had been heard from Mihara regarding another game, and only one other Japanese player had achieved GM since 2008. Coming into 2014, the activity was even more absent. More people were leaving the community than joining. Mihara was still miserable and bitter. Really bitter, actually. This is a harsh thing to say. The TC forums were largely dormant, and it appeared as if the TGM series may have finally run its course. What is the future of Tetris? Who or what influences how people play? Is it the people themselves or the inscrutable business managers? Henk had been placing his finger on the scale. If he had any way to ensure the future of Tetris would be his future, he'd take it. But his actions were never personal. He didn't enforce the guideline because it was his. He simply saw what all the executives saw, what Nintendo and EA and THQ saw. They saw Tetris as a purely casual game, the game anyone can play. Mihara believed in a different future, a future where the most dedicated Tetris players could hone their skills and become masters. He fought for that future with everything he had, and he lost. Which is weird, because Henk wanted roughly the same thing. Alexei did too. They were never foes to the TGM series, but I deduce that the reason their TGM Olympics idea still hadn't happened yet was that it would get in the way of TTC's primary interest.
Money.
Did you know, back in 2006, Henk claimed in an interview that TTC gave out licenses for two reasons: for games that made them money, and for games that moved Tetris forward. I have no idea why he said this, maybe at the time he actually believed it. All the world's great ideas could not outshine the alluring green of the dollar. Actually, there kind of had been a TGM Olympics. Concurrently to the TGM community's slow decline, a separate Tetris sub-community was beginning to re-enter the mainstream.
I can't really imagine a person being too much better than Jones.
Yeah. No, I've been watching him. He's just about as good as he can get.
The TGM community's distant cousin, the NES Tetris community, had been almost completely dormant since the 1990 Nintendo World Championships. That was, until it caught the interest of a long-time Tetris fan, coincidentally also named Mihara. Robin Mihara was itching to track down the best Tetris players across the United States and have them battle in a tournament. However, from his American point of view, the quintessential Tetris was the NES version, which is also what happened to have the most impressive scores on high-score website Twin Galaxies. So, in August 2010, Robin hosted the Classic Tetris World Championship in Los Angeles, California, and the game of choice was NES Tetris. Attending the event was Trey Harrison and Thor Ackerland, two of the top players from the Nintendo World Championships, as well as Jonas Neubauer and Harry Hong, some of the only people skilled enough to max out the game's score, an admittedly much harder feat than maxing out Sega's Tetris. Henk and Alexei liked the idea, both of them made appearances at the event, and TTC was one of the sponsors.
Who's the best player in the world? And,
we really haven't found out.
A film crew was also present to record the tournament as part of a documentary, which is where I've been getting all the footage for this chapter. It's interesting to see what Americans considered the peak of Tetris performance. Since most of them grew up with the NES and Game Boy versions, they had no idea the TGM series even existed. That's Kataru. He was at the tournament too. So the documentary people certainly knew about TGM. There's an entire section of just him talking about it.
I think I first played back when I saw, it was one of those videos that went around on YouTube. It was, I think, Tetris Japan Finals or something was what it was labeled. It was a death mode video.
It even shows a clip of Gen 8's viral GM video, and it uses Null Pamino for example footage of Invisible Tetris. Don't tell me Hara. No, the other one. Also, this was mere days before the TGM4 cancellation announcement, but Henk did also mention at the event that he was a fan of the TGM series. Come to think of it, there's no way Robin Mihara didn't know about any of the viral TGM videos if he was searching for the best Tetris players, and Kataru was already a master GM, so this seems like an easy win. There were 8 spots for the finals, and getting into that top 8 required either being one of the 5 pre-selected top players, which Kataru wasn't, or being in the top 3 for the qualifying round, which required playing nearly perfectly on NES Tetris's B-type. After getting a great score, Kataru thought he had a spot.
I think I have a spot.
He did not have a spot.
It might just be that I got knocked out.
He's so cute. He's the little baby Grandmaster.
Kataru may have been the most skilled overall Tetris player at the event, but he wasn't the best NES Tetris player, because again, the skill doesn't just carry over. So he was relegated to the sidelines, while the still very impressive Jonas went on to win. But this was not the end of the Classic Tetris World Championship. They wanted it to become annual. So the second annual championship was held in October 2011, the same month that the documentary went out, and this time Kataru made it all the way to the finals against Jonas, who would go on to win a second time. Jonas was just on another level when it came to NES Tetris. Unfortunately, the 2011 tournament had a concerningly poor attendance relative to its cost. But the success of the documentary, along with a switch to another venue, meant CTWC could return in 2012. And from here, the community only grew, forming a new, revitalized scene centered around classic Tetris. Henk and Alexei wished for Tetris to become a competitive esport, the monkey paw curled, and their first mainstream Tetris tournament was for a 20-year-old non-guideline game that didn't even have a versus mode. They did try to transform it into something more modern. The 2011 event was actually just called the Tetris World Championship, and there was a separate tournament for the recently released PS3 version of Tetris, but most people were there for the NES tournament, and by 2012 the championship was officially classic again. That documentary really did wonders for the classic Tetris community. TGM could sure use some more exposure. Erika hadn't obliterated the Gen 8 video off YouTube yet, but the community didn't really have much to offer as of late. Kevin and Steve didn't have videos of their GMs, and besides, another takedown wave could occur at any time. The TGM community could be revitalized, but it would need some serious exposure. Shooting Game Weekly is a set of YouTube and Twitch channels dedicated to weekly shoot-'em-up game content created in December 2012. Starting in July 2013, the channel began hosting awesome game replays events in which they would take some time away from their usual content to shine a spotlight on other types of arcade games. The first event covered the 1988 game Ghouls and Ghosts. The second, hosted in March 2014, covered its predecessor Ghosts and Goblins, and the third, hosted in April, covered the TGM series. Present at the event was the recently remotivated Kevin, Kitaru, and as a pleasant surprise, CT, who hadn't been active in the community since the Prohibition drama. The people behind STG Weekly, being arcade players who also happened to enjoy TGM, already had cabinets for the games on location, making setting up the event extremely simple. And it went pretty well. CT managed a death GM in his first run by the skin of his teeth, followed by Kitaru managing a master GM. But this was not the only TGM exhibition going on. Merely a week later, TI Grandmaster Khan took a trip to France and gave an astounding performance live on stage. But first, some context. For the past few years, Jago had been carrying TGM exhibitions in France, both in terms of skill and in working to make them happen. Back in 2010, he had helped set up a tap cabinet at the Stunfest Gaming Festival in Rennes. The game drew a lot of interest at the event, which allowed it to return in 2011, this time with a bigger space that allowed a larger crowd to gather. Stunfest 2012 was even more generous, offering Jago a live stage performance, and he was now also giving performances at a variety of other French gaming events, including one where he managed to achieve MM. He had been invited to perform again at Stunfest 2013, however due to logistical issues he wasn't able to bring a TI board to the event. No problem, by this point the game was available through an emulator, so he just used that instead. This turned out to be a bad decision, because Mihara ended up finding out, and Jago was now permanently on his list of grudges. And I mean permanently. 12 entire years after this, Jago tweeted at Mihara regarding TGM. Mihara unblocked him, said thank you for the feedback, I still haven't forgotten May 13th, 2013, and promptly reblocked him. Mihara had also harassed the Stunfest organizers about it, but luckily real boards were available for the 2014 performance, and better yet, Khan had arrived all the way from Japan to perform. And he was really good, achieving both a fast MM and an S13. Thanks to Khan's stunning abilities, Stunfest 2014 was possibly the most popular live TGM performance yet. Following the success of Stunfest and the Awesome Game Replays stream, fellow French player Clex began talks to include a TGM segment in the upcoming 2015 edition of the annual speedrunning event Awesome Games Done Quick, set to occur in early January. This was not an easy idea to make a case for. The GDQ organizers were pretty narrow with what they considered speedruns at the time, and although TGM is a game based around speed, it's not played in a traditional speedrunning format. However, the success of the previous performances demonstrated that the game could be appealing to an audience, and luckily, Clex managed to obtain an hour-long segment at the event. This would not be as simple as Stunfest or AGR though, as not only would Clex have to fly from France to the US, but CT also had to bring his arcade boards in from Canada. After some trouble setting up, the rescheduling of the segment to a different time slot, and Culex arriving from France mere hours before the event, CT, Kevin and Kitaru all returned on January 8th, 2015 to play a full exhibition with all three games in the series, but this time to a much larger audience.
Everybody, let's do it. We got this.
Yeah, we got this.
The segment starts with a simultaneous playthrough of TGM1 by all four players. Kevin and CT top out, while Clex and Kitaru make their way to GM. After a few decent games in Tap, Master and Death, Kitaru was challenged to go for a secret grade thanks to a donation incentive. Just because the pattern seems simple does not mean GM is an easy feat. Most of the bottom rows can be done consistently, but the last few largely come down to luck. Despite multiple moments close to death, he pulls off an extraordinary game and achieves GM first try. Then Kevin's on to play Classic Rule Master, the mode that had plagued him for the past 4 years. In a fantastic display of skill, he manages to play well all the way through, earning him an MM on his first try. On a roll, he then enters Shirase, managing an S11, and to finish it off, a doubles game with CT and Kataru. AGDQ had clearly rubbed its luck off on Kevin. After the event, he began to go for Classic GM again, and later that same month...
Oh! Woo! Oh, that's good. I think it was a Tetris at the end. I'm like trying to tell you. I heard a sound. I remember you got the one on the bottom and then there's one on the top. What are you looking for here at the end? The yellow one.
All things considered, the AGDQ exhibition went surprisingly well. Over 100,000 people were watching it live, many of whom had never even heard of the series before, so this could end up being great for TGM's future. Mihara hadn't realized it yet, but this level of interest could indicate to TTC and any publishers that the TGM series could be profitable after all. It could solve the catch-22, but success would not be handed out on a silver platter. Mihara would still have to overcome his disdain for the Western community. It all comes down to him.